So tonight, we are going to talk about the death of the single-family zone. What now? Before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to frame the discussion a little bit and hopefully give you some food for thought. Each panelist will then give a short presentation, followed by a panel discussion which will include questions from the audience at the end. So, first of all, for the uninitiated, what is a single-family zone? A zoning bylaw is a set of rules that local governments use to specify how a property may be developed and used. The zoning bylaws came about in Canada in the 1920s. The intent of zoning is to keep incompatible uses away from each other. So, for example, people didn't want to live beside a dirty, smelly factory, for example. In the case of single-family zoning in Vancouver, the intent was very much to maintain the west side as single-family homes in order to preserve property values and to essentially segregate the city by socioeconomic status. So let's quickly go back to the 1920s. There was a guy named Harland Bartholomew who was a prominent American urban planner. He was hired to put together Vancouver's first comprehensive plan, known as a Plan for the City of Vancouver. When asked what sorts of issues he should consider in the zoning bylaw he was preparing, he was told that the only serious abuse is the intrusion of undesirable apartment houses into residential districts. This planning process was later praised by the chairman of the Point Grey Town Planning Commission as a success because, at present time, over 90% of the municipality is zoned for one-family dwelling districts. Point Grey has no slum districts. So, this was the 1920s. It's been 100 years, guys. We'd like to think that the exclusionary sentiment that resonated back in those days has largely disappeared. Here is the front page of the Vancouver Sun 12 days ago. It was talking about a proposed rezoning for a 5-story project under the city's MRP, which stands for Moderate Income Rental Housing Pilot Program. So here we have members of the Kitsilano Neighborhood Association protesting the project. They said that the trade-off of adding 63 rental homes, 13 of which are guaranteed at below market rents, isn't worth having a 5-story building in their neighborhood. And in case you're wondering, below market rents are for people that make between $30,000 to $80,000 a year, and the median income for Vancouver renters is about $50,000 a year. I have a quote from the article, make the unit smaller and make the building higher. Well, that's like the ghetto. You're dropping the ghetto in Kitsilano. We are one of the treasures of the city. Single-family zoning has been used as a tool to exclude areas of the city from certain socioeconomic groups. Those who simply don't make enough, renters, new immigrants, certain races. In our region, the right to access these areas now seems to be reserved for the lucky few. Those who maybe bought a long time ago, or those who have inherited their homes or inherited their wealth. This happens actually all across North America, where single-family zoning encompasses a majority of the land base. With a restricted land supply and a growing population, this means that the majority of land no longer accommodates the majority of residents. But of course, some things have changed in the last 100 years. We've densified town centers along arterial routes as a developer. We've got a number of single-family lot assemblies that we're building multifamily developments on. So we have townhouses, a 4-story and a 6-story on lots that were previously single-family. There are also more hidden or gentle forms of density in the form of secondary suites, laneway houses, or houseplexes. The City of Vancouver is currently in a trial period to allow duplexes in 67,000 RS lots. Many major US cities are also trying this out. There is a current proposal in Portland to allow up to 4plexes on a single-family lot. Minneapolis has been facing a housing shortage and affordability issues. Sounds familiar? This past December, as part of their new citywide plan, they banned single-family zoning, allowing duplexes and triplexes in this zone. This affects about 60% of their land base. So, this is a complex issue with no one-size-fits-all solution. In order to accommodate growing populations and to address housing affordability, we're probably going to have to move beyond the single-family zone. So, What now? How do we evolve into the next generation of homes and families in our traditionally lowest density areas? If there is an evolution, at what pace should it or will it occur? And what are some of the tools we can use to get there? What are the conversations we need to be having, and whose voices do we need to prioritize in these conversations? So with that, we are going to hand it over to each panelist. I'm going to introduce our first panelist with all the answers to the questions I just posed, Michael Mortensen. Michael brings over 20 years of development and urban planning experience to his consulting work at Livable City Planning, where he leads teams and manages all aspects of the development of transformative mixed-use projects. A developer and a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners, Michael understands development from both the private and public perspective. His experience includes projects at scale in Greater Vancouver, Toronto, LA, London, England, and Edinburgh. Please welcome to the podium, Michael Mortensen.
So, who is this guy, 130 years old today, or this year, and why do we still let him dictate how we live? Everyone knows who he is. It's Harland Bartholomew. As Jane mentioned, he did a lot of planning for Vancouver through the 20s and even into the 40s. I think he's mostly a road engineer / planner, to defend my profession, but pretty old school. So of course, the Vancouver that Harland Bartholomew planned, you're familiar with it. It's mostly single detached zoning. It was an ideographic plan. He kind of drew what was there and then froze much of the city, probably with 60 to 80% of the city. He froze it in aspic and said, this will be single family in perpetuity. So, oh yeah, and to Jane's point, the encroachment of apartments and retail stores were the worst offenders. I think this was the bias of the age, and it reflected a time, of course, when people were coming out of the Depression, the First World War, the Depression. The needs and exigencies of the day dictated that people who didn't have a lot of money double up, stack up in multiple unit buildings, rooming houses, and this is what he was, and a lot of people in Vancouver were fighting against. But the city that we have today in 2017 looks a heck of a lot like Harland Bartholomew's Vancouver of 1927. But things have changed. You all have your tax forms, right? Do you still live in 1927? I don't think so. I don't wear those pants. In 1927, you can get a Sears Roebuck catalog and buy this lovely duplex for $2,639, $45 a month. Of course, Harland wouldn't allow a duplex in RS zones. There were single detached uses, so you couldn't even do that. I'm kind of rocking this. I'm doing this in Excel. So there's Vancouver. The city center, of course, it's a high-density district. Streetcars proliferated in Vancouver in the 1889. City founded in 1886. 3 years later, we had electric mass transport. Pretty fantastic. The streetcar grid went out into the streetcar suburbs of Mount Pleasant, Strathcona, Kitsilano, Fairview Slopes, and there established a pretty interesting neighborhood before Vancouver had this zoning that Harland Bartholomew introduced. And those streetcar suburbs bubbled and evolved. I mean, they started as single detached homes, but then they quickly evolved into multiple units, walk-ups, rooming houses, small apartments. You're familiar with them. These are the leafiest, most nice neighborhoods in our city, in our region, highly valued, right? Not a ghetto. And we have multifamily units sitting adjacent to single detached homes in this organic brew before Harland Bartholomew introduced single family zoning to Vancouver and stopped the encroachment of these offending multifamily uses. So the outer suburbs really reflect that 1927 Harland Bartholomew pattern. Of course, if you look at Vancouver, and these are the neighborhood population stats from the city, the downtown, the West End, 5% of our land, 17% of our people. Strathcona, the streetcar suburbs, 15% of the land, 19% of our people. They're overperforming. Underperforming are our great outer suburbs, 80% of the land, 63% of the people. So where's the obvious place to look for some better efficiency and better use out of our land base? We're a land-constrained region, land-constrained city, clearly the suburbs. So you all have your tax forms. This is Mr. and Mrs. Average Vancouver. You've all got your T4s, so I want to play a little game. Everybody stand up, please. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, we're going to play the inequity game. Planners are interested in equity. We're interested in urban form and urban design, and we know we can do multifamily fantastically well at all sorts of densities and have livable cities, livable neighborhoods, leafy streets. We know this, right? So if you have $1 of household income and you pay 32% of your shelter, your income for shelter, at a 3.6% interest rate, you can afford a home of $12. Right. So I'm going to start with those of you who have incomes under $42,000. You can afford a house that's $497,000. Is that a single detached home? No. But I got bad news for you, because it's not 3.6% that the bank is charging you for your mortgage. The federal government has decided to put a 2% surcharge on that. The stress test, you have to qualify at 5.6, so you can only afford a $320,000 home. So if you have income of $42,000 or less, please sit down. Excellent. Okay, $47,500. You can afford a $361,000 house. Please sit down. $55,000. You can afford a $419,000 apartment. Please sit down. $65,000. $495,000. You can sit down too. $75,000. Now we're into median income. That's your household income, by the way. Those are probably two income earners on your T4 there. $75,000. $571,000. You can sit down too. $85,000. $647,000. It's not even going to buy an apartment in Vancouver. You can sit down. Let's go up to 112. Well, top quartile. $137,500. Okay, $1 million. Still not enough for an East Side house. Please have a seat. Now we're left with people, essentially 17% of the population, $175,000 and up. So let's look at $175,000 of income. That's pretty good income. Oops, nope. Sorry, I shorted you on your last paycheck. Again. $1.3 million. You're close to an East Side house. Please sit down. So the rest of you standing, $200,000 of income and above represent less than 8% of Vancouver's population. So if I put $200,000 in here, you can afford a $1.5 million house at 25% down at a 5.6. Don't sit down yet. So, yeah, so we've gone through the income. This is the stress test has a profound effect. There's an economic equity issue here. We can handle the design. We know how to do great buildings at scale, at density, at livability. But this is the problem. We've got 60% of our land base in this city, and probably as much in the region, that only 8%, less than 8% of our population can afford. We have a massive problem. This isn't sustainable. It's not going to work. So you guys can sit down. I've made my point. So that's it. So what are we going to do? We're going to break bulk. I think the way forward is a new Vancouver special. I wrote about this in 2016 when I was still in London, thinking about moving back to Vancouver. And the answer is simple. We know we've done this in Kitsilano, Strathcona, Fairview Slopes, all over the city. It's not rocket science. It's not new. It's a new Vancouver special. We know we need to break up that cake, right? This cake is a pretty rich, expensive cake. If you look at this, 0.7 FSR, 0.7 times the site area, 2 levels, 3,300 square feet. It's a 40 by 120. I mean, Vancouver has the DNA of this city is a 33 by 120 lot, a 40 by 120, a 60 by 120. They're all pretty generic. They're Big Macs. right? We know how to do this. We can standardize multiple unit forms of housing and do them well. So can you afford this cake? Well, only if you make over $200,000 a year. So my prescription, my answer, is to cut the cake. All right. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Michael. Next up, we have Mayor Richard Stewart. Mayor Stewart was originally elected in 2005 and now serving his 4th term as the mayor of the city of Coquitlam. He is also currently serving as the chair of Metro Vancouver's Liquid Waste Committee and also sits on the Regional Planning Committee. Prior to Coquitlam Council, Richard served as the MLA for Coquitlam-Millardville. Richard has also served as the chair of National Housing Economic Research, as president for the Canadian Home Builders Association of BC, as president of the School District 43 Parent Advisory Council, and as a member of the National Research Council's IRC Housing Committee in Ottawa, the body that writes the National Building Code of Canada. Richard also worked as a consultant for the provincial government and established a homeowner protection office and in developing the consumer protection regulations associated with builder licensing and home warranty. Please welcome to the podium Mayor Richard Stewart.
Rebecca used to work at the City of Coquitlam until tonight, and then there's a rule that says that, you know, if you're invited to an event at 6 o'clock, there'll be dinner. And then Michael shows up with pictures of food. And so the premise is single family zone dead. Right now, our biggest challenge in the region, of course, is that we can't afford to live here. The vast majority of people, you know, my parents, this is before I was born, my parents got married and my mother wanted she was French Canadian, she wanted her children raised in French, so she made a decision that they probably went on the internet to try to find some French schools. Yeah, someone got it. Thank you, Heather. This is the 1950s, and they found that there are 2 French schools in a community called Millardville in Coquitlam, French-Canadian community, so off we went. They moved to, and there the house was more expensive than the ones shown here. It was $12,000, including lot, for a single-family home in 1958 in Coquitlam, and they bought one. And after her death, of course, we sold it for $1 million because that's what real estate has done. At that point, it was essentially, he was making it was about 45 cents a square foot for the land, 45 cents a square foot. Today it's $500 a square foot for the land. And obviously, wages haven't gone up that much. Wages have gone up by about tenfold, and land has gone up by 350 times. In the same period. So obviously we can't afford as much land as we could afford when my parents got married. So is it dead? Well, let's go through the phases of life. When you get to be my age, then you start to consider, well, let's at least retire. That means we can't do what we used to do. Others will take over. Then you start to feel broken. Not just a facelift, but you know, parts that aren't working anymore, parts that need replacing. Maintenance that goes up. Eventually, people are asking, is John still alive? He's put in a home, there's life support, and then there's decay. And decay starts to evolve, and some people can live longer, but the reality is that, yes, the single-family zone is dead. We cannot do it anymore. In the we've got an urban containment boundary in Metro Vancouver, and I'm on the Regional Planning Committee, and we're fighting hard to hold on to the urban containment boundary in spite of the fact that so many new elected officials across the region haven't yet embraced it necessarily. But if it holds, and I hope it will, we won't have any more land. So here we are in Coquitlam. Coquitlam, about 15 miles to the east, 20 kilometers to the east, depend on the exchange rate. This is SkyTrain, the way that I would normally get between Coquitlam and Vancouver. The extension that you can see there, you can see yellow area here, it's Burquitlam on the west edge of Coquitlam. It's right up against the Burnaby border. And there's a tunnel that goes into the 2 stations in Port Moody, and that's all I'm going to say about Port Moody. And then our city center with the 3 stations down there. Those are our transit-oriented development areas in Coquitlam. We also have another development area, Burke Mountain. It's the last green field before you get to a bridge, is Burke Mountain. It was designated as housing 30 years ago, so it will be developed, but that's it. We're not doing any more greenfield. That leaves this, and that's the part of Coquitlam I grew up in. In fact, I grew up right in the middle of this circle. This is southwest, we call it southwest Coquitlam. It is the old part of Coquitlam that was developed in the 1900s. A little bit of it in the 1800s, but almost all of it developed in the 1900s. And it's all original subdivisions. It's the 60 by 120 lot. 66 by 120, so it's a 1/4 acre gross density. 60% of them have lane access. We've been growing, Coquitlam has been, because we're one of the communities of Metro Vancouver, and Metro Vancouver has to absorb population. We're growing, in the last 5 years, we grew by 9.8%, which is about 2% a year. The southwest Coquitlam didn't grow by that much, but there are areas of Coquitlam that have grown much more, and those are particularly around the SkyTrain stations. We started to build the density around the SkyTrain stations before we got SkyTrain. Many of you have heard the coining of the phrase "never green line," and it was because we waited for 25 years for the Evergreen Line to start to get built. So our challenge is we can put some density around SkyTrain stations now, obviously, and we're doing that. In fact, we're being criticized for that. And some communities are more challenged when it comes to that. In fact, I guess it isn't the last time I'll mention Port Moody. Port Moody just voted down a townhouse development within 400 meters of a SkyTrain station because everybody that showed up at the public hearing was opposed to that enormous density of townhouses near a SkyTrain station. And so those are the challenges. And you'll hear it from me tonight as we take the panel, because I'm going to ask that society stop asking local governments and elected officials stop asking us to be courageous. There is at least one of you in the audience that knows what it's like to be courageous and to advance what you think is right and to not be there anymore because the voters didn't buy into that. We actually have a system in British Columbia where new neighborhoods are designed by the neighborhood. It's the law. It says public hearing. Public hearing means invite everyone that's really got a stake in this. Invite everybody, but the only ones that will show up and won't be at home surfing the net or whatever. Invite everybody, but the ones that will show up are the ones that are opposed to it. And that happens time and time and time again. We will go through a public hearing, we'll have 10 people show up and speak, and all 10 of them will be opposed, and then we have to, and we've been good, our council, to their credit, has almost always unanimously voted in favor of the projects that need to be advanced because they have staff recommendation and they're in line with our OCP, but we'll have 10 people speaking against and nobody but the proponent in favor. That goes particularly in these housing choices area. We developed a program called Housing Choices, and that's the borders of it. It allowed up to 4 homes on a single family lot. It's called neighborhood attached residential in the zoning sense, although they don't have to be attached. There have been some really good examples. You left this one in. There are some really good examples. This isn't one of them. So this was a garden cottage, and I said, could we just, I don't know, let's add some flowers or something like that. Let's do some Photoshop. Vines, yes, exactly. What do planners do with their mistakes? We know what architects do. So we also have carriage homes. These are off of a back lane. We saw 60% of our existing neighborhoods are on back lanes, and we've had good success with carriage homes. With subdivisions into narrow lots, so 66 down to 233s. That's 20 meter down to 210s for those of you who don't speak Imperial. This is a duplex. You can't quite tell, but they're detached, or slightly attached, triplex. And this one here, which is the one that I've been advancing most strongly, is the quadruplex. This is 4 single-family homes, detached single-family homes on a single-family lot. We've got a number of examples of this, and it worked out really well. Unfortunately, the landowner went with the maximum size they could build, so you ended up with some 2,200 square foot single-family homes and went high ceilings and really luxury. So they sold in the 900, but 900 is much better than 2.6 million, which is what most of these single-family homes that get redeveloped into single-family houses, brand new, sell in the 2.5 range. So moving forward, the challenges clearly are governance structure. We can't have a system where we give the veto effectively to the neighborhood that wants a veto. And that means, so I said I was coming to this on social media, and I liked it. And suddenly, there was a bunch of people angry at me because I would go to anything called the single-family zone is dead. Because they live in a single-family zone and they've pretty much done it. They've got their cake, and they're gonna put glass cover over it. They're gonna put it in the freezer because they're holding on to this damn cake, even though I haven't had dinner yet. So my main points will be, don't ask us to be courageous. The biggest barriers will be the realities associated with the way we advance zoning, but we absolutely need this. I did a project once with Jenish House Design. Jenish did a lot of work, Ron Jenish, when he was alive, did a lot of work in Japan. He loved Japan. And one of the projects, I didn't go to Japan, but I was working a little bit on the project. It was a 22 units to the acre, single-family housing. And it really got me start thinking about how we can use our land more efficiently. We brought one of those teams back to our property when we were building my house in Coquitlam, and a busload of Japanese planners came in, and they got out and they said, well, what are you going to build in that area? And I said, that's our side yard. Nothing goes there. And they said, we could build an apartment building. So we really can do a lot more, and I'm looking so much forward to this panel. Thank you. And Rebecca made the slide. She's an amazing, amazing planner.
Up next, we have Lynn Roxburgh, who has worked at the City of New Westminster for 13 years. She led the review of the official community plan, which was adopted in 2017. She also led the creation of the infill housing program, which resulted in laneway houses and infill townhouses being permitted in the city. Her focus is now on increasing the opportunity to build duplexes and triplexes on properties currently used for single detached houses. Please welcome to the podium, Lynn Roxburgh.
Going the wrong way. Thank you very much. And as was said, my name is Lynn, and I'm a planner with New Westminster. And I'm actually one of the long-range planners for the city, which means that I get to spend a lot of time thinking about the future of our single-family homes. So I'm quite excited to be here and be part of this conversation today. As I'm sure you all know, New Westminster is a very small urban municipality. We had a population of 72,000 people in 2016, and our area is only 15 square kilometers. So we're actually the second densest municipality in BC, second only to Vancouver. And we've gotten that way by growing, by having high rises around our core areas. So for us, that's our downtown, our uptown neighborhood, and now our SkyTrain stations. But what that's meant is that more or almost 70% of our housing units in the city are apartment units. The large majority of what's left are single-family units. And so what that's meant is we don't have good housing choice in the city. That talk that we always have about missing middle housing, it really is missing in New Westminster. And we really feel that that has an impact on our community. If you can't make apartment living work for you, we've really thought about trying to improve apartment living, but if you can't make apartment living work and you can't afford a single family house, as we've made clear tonight, a lot of people can't, then it means that you can't meet your housing needs in New Westminster. So we hear stories about people who are seniors who want to downsize, but maybe aren't ready to go all the way to an apartment unit. They want that transition zone. Or we hear stories of families who have been living in New Westminster for a number of years. They've had their second, their third kid, and now it's really hard to make a small apartment work. And we know that a lot of those people are having to move out of the city and out of the region to find the right housing. So we really want to start talking about housing choice and ground-oriented housing and how we can start to accommodate that within our single-family neighborhoods. So we want to embrace the full range of housing choice. We want to think about laneway housing, duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, row houses, townhouses, whatever it looks like, to start adding that diversity and start adding that diversity into our single-family neighborhoods. We hope that we can also layer on some other diversity elements as well. So how do we get different tenures in here? How do we get rental housing as well as freehold, as well as strata? So there's lots more diversity from that perspective as well. How can we use design to facilitate different livability for different people? So maybe there's some that's very oriented towards family housing. Maybe we have some housing that's seniors friendly. So for example, we've been encouraging single-story accessible laneway housing, trying to encourage people to have that opportunity to age in place. So thinking about all those different layers rather than just the housing form. We've been lucky enough, as was said in the introduction, to just do our new official community plan. And that's given us a lot of opportunity to talk to the community about what this means for them, why we should start thinking about housing choice, and how to pull this off in a way that they're going to be supportive of in their neighborhood. Of course we do, or I would say that in this round of conversation, there was way more openness to having this idea of change, starting to integrate different uses into their neighborhoods. People had much more of a sense of urgency because they had personal stories about them, their family, their friends that couldn't afford housing and how it was impacting their lives and why they would benefit so much from this housing. So I felt that there was a lot more momentum. It was a different story in a lot of cases when we started to narrow down to a neighborhood level or perhaps a specific block. It was harder to have those conversations because sometimes it's a personal connection where people have been born and raised, they've lived there all their lives, they raise their kids there, they have a personal connection to the tree house that was built in that backyard, and so it becomes really hesitant and scary to start talking about change. Of course, there's always the typical things that we hear. People are worried about parking, they're worried about traffic, people are worried about the impact on city infrastructure. Can we keep up with our park space, our recreation facilities? School space is a big thing that we hear about. But the group who really, I think, changed the conversation a lot was young families. They really made an effort, and we made an effort to try to engage them. And they really had the urgency, and knowing that sometimes we're probably too slow to keep up with their needs, but at least they were there advocating for their kids, thinking about what their kids would need as they get older. And one of the things that I appreciate that they brought to the conversation was not just about the importance of the housing choice, but integrating that housing choice throughout the neighborhood. So I know that as planners, we sort of have a default of putting different uses on the edges as transitions between zones. We put these different uses along routes where we want to see greater transportation. We're trying to leverage increased bus service. And they really talked about the importance of integrating all of these uses within the neighborhood and really having it seamless and integrated and throughout a community. So is the single-family home zone dead in New Westminster? We're probably working that way, though it still is a huge amount of our single-family home area. We, through the OCP process, were able to adopt laneway housing, and so that's now as of right for every property. So everybody can build a single-family house, a secondary suite, and a laneway house. So we've taken the first step, but I think there's a lot more steps for us to take in terms of how we more properly implement this housing choice and get more diversity in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And our last panelist up for the evening is Jake Frey. Jake Frey started Small Works in late 2005 and became a strong advocate for the introduction of laneway housing. He established Small Works Studios and Laneway Housing, Inc., and worked with the City of Vancouver and other municipalities to help develop zoning bylaws based on his experience and interaction with literally hundreds of potential small home clients. In 2012, Jake was one of 2 founding directors of Small Housing BC, a nonprofit society, and in 2014, Jake was named EY's Entrepreneur of the Year in Manufacturing. Today, Jake focuses on finding new ways to broaden the range of housing types in Vancouver to create affordable options for single-family home ownership. Please welcome to the podium, Jake Frey.
So thanks for coming out tonight. I'm really honored to be in with this panel of speakers, and I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about Small Housing BC. So Small Housing BC is a not-for-profit that we started because there was such a strong uptake and support of the laneway housing movement. Heather, who's here, was one of the councillors who have helped pass this. It was a long evening, that first evening, and second evening, and third evening, and maybe 3.5 evenings for laneway housing to go through. About 50% in favor, 50% opposed, and Richard will attest to that. That's about 75% support. And we'd have more people too, and you would as well, by the way, if you brought cake to the council meetings.
You're going to talk food again.
I know. So, but I mention that because I do believe that although we ongoingly have a perception, and within our industry, within the collective, that there's a lot of pushback to change, I would actually assert there's actually a great appetite for it. What we have found in our work, and what we have done primarily, is looked at what can we do to help both primarily the environment and also affordable and attainable housing for people by starting to look at what do we do with our land? How do we start to focus on bringing more appropriate housing across BC into the communities that are struggling with housing? And they all are. Last year, as part of a project, we went and spoke to 27 cities and municipalities across the province. Every meeting had the same points. We can't afford where we live. We don't have the right type of housing. What are we going to do for our kids, and what are we going to do for the future? And it's a tough problem, but it's not an insurmountable one. And we look at Vancouver, and Michael's numbers point out in the most expensive land in the country, probably, we're dealing with population densities per hectare that are not dissimilar from what we might find in the outer regions of Winnipeg. You know, these are places where we need to live, and this improves our community and our environment as we populate them appropriately. So our work over the last, coming up to 8 years now, has been to go out and do research projects. Our first research project was to interview the 9 direct neighbors of the first 300 laneway homes that went in. And we found out some amazing stats. My favorite one is that parking was an issue before, a fear. Parking was not a problem, but remained a fear, even for those homes that had been in 3 years later. But more importantly, 30% of the people who lived beside the laneway homes now wanted one for themselves. So we've gone through a number of publications. They're up on the board here, and they're available on our website. We looked at the 10 best practices across North America for infill. We did a how-to guide for communities to integrate infill into their neighborhoods, how to liaison with communities. Did a really interesting study about what we would do with a parcel of land in Surrey around creating no more density, but 12 times the amount of households on the same piece of property. What was the environmental impact? What was the affordability? Obviously, both of them became much better as we started to utilize the land better. Most recently, and what we're going to talk about a little later tonight, is a study we did on perpetual affordable housing, which is one of our ideas that we're trying to promote in our next term of 3 years for our next project. But really, what we've done is to reach out to the communities and help the communities as a kind of a knowledge base. We've really collected atypical knowledge that we can begin to share, but really focusing on something that we genuinely feel is not the silver bullet, but certainly a linchpin to how we can move forward and really approach our neighborhoods. And I would say that one of the key parts of this is how do we enable this development? And there's some bullet points up here, but at the core, I think what really comes home time and time again is that when we look at approaching trying to create housing, there's 2 things we cannot ignore. One is that our cities have been developed with these single lots. So anything that we introduce into a neighborhood, if it addresses a single lot, we may use a single lot differently, but if it addresses that, if it addresses the opportunities, the potential out of that lot that benefit the people who live on that lot, we will have a very easy path going forward. What that may look like may be very different, but if we can utilize that one fulcrum that its planners and developers and architects and interested citizens have, how can I make my neighborhood better for me and for the people who I want to live with and for the people who want to live with me? That is a much different discussion than this is what we're going to do in your neighborhood. So this is our matrix that we work with, and this is what we'll be moving forward with over the next 3 years as we try currently to build a province-wide coalition to really start to move forward some opportunities across the province in some pilot cities and with interested communities that want to work with us. I will touch a couple of minutes. This is one of our projects that we're working on right now. It's called Perpetual Affordable Home Ownership. What this contemplates is taking a standard city lot, bonusing an affordability context, much like you would with a bigger development. And what this might look like is that we would end up with, on a 50-foot lot, 5 to 6 residences, a number of them likely, in the case of 5, 4, and units at market, one that is not at market. And to that end, the idea being is that we put a negative covenant on it. That not-for-market unit is for the mean income. Let the market do what it will with the market units, but we'll forever protect one unit so that starter home for that family, for that home that should be housing the people that live and work in that neighborhood, will always be in situ. And so we've looked at some models, and again, the form will change. Every community will be a little different. This is modeled after some context of what we have in the city right now. But what we look at here, and going back to Michael's slide, we end up with 4 units that are available for roughly something under that 8% of the homeowners. So we expanded the market, but then we also have 1 unit that's at $80,000. And these are nice units. These are family-sized 2-bedroom units. And the good news is it already exists. So here is a community, one of our board members is Jim Bussey from Formworks. This is a home he did under a heritage revitalization agreement. There are 5 households in this home that's got the yellow circle around it. And it fits into the community. So if we start doing this type of work, we start bringing townhomes, small apartment blocks, but we start putting them on single-family lots, benefiting the people on that lot, we will start to have a path forward that I think will really bring the change to the communities that we need to. Thank you.
Now we're going to get into some questions. So I'll start with Jake. You showed us a great model, and I especially liked that, we have to note that when we talk about the death of single-family zoning, it doesn't necessarily mean the death of the detached house as a built form. So with that example, there's opportunities to preserve the form and character of the neighborhoods that people love so much. Your feasibility study shows that it does work. And you touched on this, but maybe we can delve a little bit deeper into why aren't more people doing this? Like, what are some of the biggest barriers to change, and how can we overcome them? And this is to everybody, but if you want to elaborate.
I'll start. From my perspective, I think.
Want to grab the mic.
Can you guys hear me okay?
And you can probably just grab it.
I have to grab it? I have to do the rock star thing? Okay.
You can.
I don't want to. So I think that there's 2 challenges. One is, and you alluded to it in your opening comments, which is that really we're living in communities that have been set up. And I think in many respects, we have regulatory practices which tend to be really focused on restrictions. I mean, that's how we've approached planning in many respects. And I think that's how many communities have approached what we're going to do. We're going to protect, whether it's creating exclusion or whether it's creating protection, that has weighed heavily. And it's a system which I believe has exhausted itself. And what we often promote in ours is that we need to really focus zoning and new regulations around performance. What's the affordability? What is the form? When we start to look at the objective rather than the risk management, I think we get a much clearer path forward.
Anybody else want to comment? There's another mic. You can pass it around.
I'll try the other mic.
Yeah, maybe grab the other mic.
This is done.
Yeah, I think with the example, for example, Vancouver, the Vancouver special of the 1960s was a sneaky way of getting a second kitchen into a single detached house. And do you remember the basement apartment secondary suite debates in the 80s? Hundreds of people went to council to protest it. But as housing prices went up and up and up, the second time it was introduced into council, maybe a decade later, something like 3 people came out to protest it. But I think what the rules in terms of that Jake's talking about really about, opening creativity to the idea of having more than one residence on one lot. That was sacrosanct for many years. Now we have the ability to do a duplex plus a laneway. There's 3. But that's not quite enough. You know, if a West Side house is $2 million, you've got to cut that cake in more pieces. And we know we can do it sensitively and with you know, in a way that respects the character of the neighborhood. But I think equity also asks us to consider the economic outcomes of planning. And that's often forgotten. Planners frequently don't pick up a pro forma. And I think a lot of people who oppose projects in neighborhoods also don't look at the social and economic equity of the proposals before them. For example, the project in Kitsilano that some people are calling a ghetto. A lot of people are focusing a lot on the 5-story form. But really, who's talking about the teacher that won't be able to live in that unit, right? The teacher, the police person, the fire person. I mean, come on. We really need to start thinking about economic, social equity as well.
Yeah, thinking about the economics, I think, is very significant. Something I think you're right, that planning doesn't do a lot. And I think that as we move forward, we're starting to see way more competing interests. We're trying to achieve a lot through every project. So we're looking at, I mean, for us, we're now thinking about electric vehicle charging to have residents ready for that. We're looking at STEPCO to make sure we have energy efficient buildings. We're looking at design quality to make sure we have open space and sort of livability for each of the units. And we're sort of adding a lot onto it, which we're doing for good reason, trying to achieve significant things. But all of that is adding cost to the project. And to try to do it in a way that's still economically viable is really challenging. And so I think most of the times where we see people picking up the opportunity to do infill is because there's very personal motivation, where you already own that lot. It's a way for you to have a coach house that your kids can live there, rather than thinking really as an investment opportunity. It's more out of a real need to make those economics work.
And so you ask yourself, how do you get it past council? How do you get past those barriers, as well as some codified barriers that we put in place? One of them is the rules for secondary suites maximize the secondary suite floor area at 900 square feet, or 20 or 40% of the floor area. That one's irrelevant, but the 900 is relevant because it's a real barrier when you're trying to produce family housing in the secondary suite form. And you can only have one. We're probably going to get past that, at least on a community acceptance, because we have so many of these really big houses in the suburbs that are 7,000 square feet, and they've got 3 suites in the basement. And one of them is legal, and the other one is, and we know they're there, and we have no tools to get rid of them, and no real appetite to get rid of them either. So we're going to end up with, I think, society taking the building code realities and trying to work the compromise that is the secondary suite rules in the BC building code. I think it's the same in Vancouver building bylaw. And work the compromise again, so that in a duplex you could, once you build a duplex, you're not eligible to build a secondary suite. By using the building code rules, you have to do it as an apartment building, and that's a different zone and all that sort of stuff. So there's those realities that we've got to get past as well. But in the end, the biggest barrier isn't the code, it isn't the zone, it's the political will and the fact that someone's going to come out and say, no, we don't want any more families in this neighborhood. I would love to get to the point where we simply say that you're allowed FSR of whatever and then build whatever you want.
I would like to see extra put on there of a certain minimum unit, because I think there still is such a desire that if you have that money that you still want to buy and build that single family home. So to really encourage people to actually build in those extra units, even if they don't do it. I mean, for a long time, we've been encouraging people, if you are building a house and you don't want a secondary suite, put it in anyway. If you live in the house as one unit, that's one thing, but eventually your needs might change, the new owner might come in, and really trying to actually build that supply, because it's so hard to go back and do it later and try to deal with changes in the building code and adding those new units, and trying to get it done right up front would be a nice objective.
So you talked a little bit, everybody sort of touched a little bit about the how, and how will this change take place. I'm curious as to your thoughts of, are we, Lynn, you alluded to the process that New West was going through, and there was a lot of positive feedback at the city level, but when you came down to the neighborhood level, there's a lot of NIMBYism, essentially. So thoughts around, are you talking incremental spot zoning? Is that more effective, or are we talking blanket zoning? What's some feedback that you might have gotten around this, and what is that public process? And you also talked about young families and how you engage those people. I have a young family myself, and I have a 10-month-old. I don't have time to go out to these public processes in the evenings because he has a bedtime of 6:30. How is this going to happen?
That was like 8 questions. So
I know, I'm sorry, I kind of threw it in there.
I'm going to start with community engagement. We had childcare offered so that people came, there was childcare for them, and we felt that we could do that with our own Parks and Rec staff, so it wasn't even having to go and find the right resources. We felt that we could build that off of our existing team that we have at the city. Only one person left their kid behind and had to come screaming back after the engagement events, but their kid was safe and well cared for. But that was a key thing. One of the other things that we did, which we partnered on another event that was already happening. So we sort of had this, like, it's what's called Beer Fridays in New Westminster, and it really is a group of young families that get together and drink craft beer and talk about the world. And so we actually went to that event and hosted sort of a mini workshop to say, we'll come to you where you're already meeting and have these conversations. So there's already good turnout and sort of motivation for people to be there. And we're actually quite lucky in New Westminster that through this process and really making an effort to get families out there, we've actually started or not we, but the city has started a Yes in New West group. And so that's really helped change the conversation, or at least balance the conversation. So when we do have these public hearings, we have groups coming out to represent both sides of the conversation. For me too, it was really important to have in-person events. So I know that it's 2019 and we should do all these really cool things on the internet, and we have all these fun things that we can do on our phones. But it was so significant to me to get people around a table and sitting and listening to each other, because so many people, regardless of their age, came to the event and said, this matters to me because, and even if you sitting next to me were really opposed to it, it was harder to get mad at the planner at the table when your neighbors had just like really put this case forward about how desperately they wanted change because there's a real need for them. And so I spent lots of money on city, trying to get those events happening rather than just relying on a generic survey, and luckily had sort of the support of the city to really put a lot of effort into those events.
So we end up with, I say it a lot, our council, I'm proud of the fact that our council supports about 98% of the firm staff recommendation at the planning, on planning items. And we do push back when we hear the voices that are the NIMBY stuff. For example, I'll use this example only because some people might laugh. The proposal was a low-income seniors building built by the Finnish Canadian Housing Seniors Housing Society or something on land they were donated by one of their members. And so I mean it ticked off all the boxes. It was absolutely wonderful, but the public consultation and the public hearing received a bunch of opposition from the building next door, because including things like, if you allow those people to live next to us, they're seniors, and there'll be ambulances in the middle of the night, and yeah. So and I cite that as an example only because we set it up so that people feel that their voices should be heard in excluding those that might change their neighborhood. Our council actually is quite good at saying, okay, the battle is at the OCP. Once we've decided that that's going to be an apartment building, don't come to us at the public hearing and say, whoa, apartment building, that's no good. So let's have that battle, but have it at OCP. And one of the reasons, though, that we are resistant to pre-zoning is because we can't extract after we've zoned. We can't extract as well or as efficiently or as lucratively if that's what we're extracting. We can't force issues as well after we've given fourth reading. And so wouldn't it be nice if we could change those rules so that we had as much power after we've zoned something at development permit as communities need, because we want the handicap parking, or we want the electric charging stations or whatever it is we're trying to get in a particular project, and we can't get it after we've zoned.
Jake, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, so I'll jump in. I guess I'd have 3 key points I'd like to mention. So one that came up in your questions was really about spot zoning, and although this is a very specific one, I think this is important because what transpires when we uniformly allow or facilitate change as a possibility around land value is it's an equalizer. If we looked at Vancouver, for example, the city went, I think quite bravely so, went, okay, we're going to do laneway houses everywhere. And then there was a set of criteria. Land value didn't change because of laneway houses, even though they're very popular and a lot are getting built now. And I would argue the housing prices didn't go up significantly beyond the investment of that unit. When we look at an area like Norquay, which facilitates some very forward-thinking opportunities, as soon as that zoning passed for that one specific area, 2 interesting projects went in, and the rest became financially non-viable because the expectation of what the land would sell for. So what I've proposed, or not, I won't say I, but what our group, Small Housing, proposes, and one of the things that we think can work very well, again, is 2 things. One, going back to the point, leveraging things at advantage of the people who currently have the property, something that meets their needs, and that we concurrently can do more than one thing. The great thing is if we put and facilitate things that can go out into communities, if those are good things, they will prosper on their own. We'll be able to monitor them, they will prosper. All of a sudden that 5-unit or that 4-unit on those city lots or small apartment buildings, if they start to work in the community and they enhance the community, they service the needs of that community, they will flourish. And if they don't, they'll die on the vine. And if we end up with a couple of buildings we don't need, it's not going to hurt anybody.
Michael?
I just think it's interesting that we're entering a period where, for example, in the city of Vancouver, we're talking about a city plan and the needs of the city, and all of you with your T4s. We need to consider at a city level the opportunities that enable a more diverse housing response throughout the city. So I think it's an interesting opportunity to look at, for example, our RS1 suburbs and ask that hard question. Why should we limit the land use on areas, for example, flanking major parks to just single detached homes? Shouldn't we be like Europe? A lot of people say, well, Vancouver, let's avoid the high rises, let's become more like Europe. Well, that means mid-rise. That means I think we should look at actually more intense forms of housing in our single detached neighborhoods, particularly in areas adjacent to huge amenities, and we shouldn't under aim, so to speak. We need I think a range of options for redeveloping them. So voices at the city level, setting policy. I think that's really important.
Michael, what you just said actually made me wonder, is there something so aspirational about a single-family home? Is it something so quintessentially Canadian, North American? It's the American dream, right, to have a white picket fence. And as we add to our region, a lot of the people I'm a first-generation immigrant. My family came here from a country that is very dense. I come from Singapore. Less than, I think, 5% of housing, of dwellings in the country are landed properties, and that includes houseplexes. So you have duplexes. The number of single-family detaches, I don't know, less than 1% perhaps. So lots of people come here in search of that. How does that mesh? Is that people come here looking for a single-family home. They want to come to North America. North America is now saying, I want to be more like Europe. What does that look like for people coming here? Are we living up to that expectation, or how can we transition?
Kitts, Mount Pleasant, Strathcona, Fairview.
And so it's back to that idea of a single-family form, typology, but then having lots of units and having opportunities. People can then have the option of owning what looks like a single-family home, I guess, but then building in opportunities for the future that Lynn alluded to. Is that kind of
I don't know. I would actually go in a different direction. I think there's the answer that I would want to respond to that initial question is around the role of ownership. And ownership in North America carries weight, right? And we don't have the social network of Western Europe, where we have large communities owning large tracts of land. We don't even barely have a land community trust in Canada. We certainly don't have one in BC. And so we don't have that backstop. So what we do need is to facilitate. Our housing spectrum works on ownership. At least a good cohort of it does. That's where people put their money for security. And so we need to facilitate opportunities for that. And I think the form is less important. As Michael says, look, we take, Heresy will take Balaclava Park and let's ring it with 4-story Georgians. I mean, we'll accommodate a lot of people. There's a huge amenity there, right? At the same time, we may not want to, in the deep, dark corner of some neighborhoods, put something that's too intrusive. But yeah, why don't we build something that either take advantage of a heritage home, which would be the best thing, or emulate a heritage home and make it like a little tiny row house in the back. There's lots of opportunities. There's no loss of creativity to do interesting things. It's the opportunity to do them and to do many at the same time.
Right.
Taking probably a different perspective, I am always surprised by how much people hold on to that dream. The amount of money that people will put into trying to get the single-family home, even though there is maybe another more livable option, or how far away they're willing to move to and drive huge amounts of distance when there might be, this sort of a smaller lifestyle, because you have, we've grown up with a lifestyle of having like your mountain bike and all these things that you want to store, and sort of I always say I don't know where to put my winter tires, my Christmas tree, but like it's those things that people want to hold on to, and I'm surprised sometimes by how much some people want to keep hold of that and try to find ways to still get there. And so hopefully we're starting to see a shift in that. And I think the housing market and the affordability really is helping people reevaluate what they actually need for space.
And yet, the vast majority of the new residents of, not the vast majority, but the majority of new residents to Coquitlam will come from another country, and will probably have lived their lives in a form other than a 60 by 120 lot with a white picket fence. And if anyone has ever owned a white picket fence, they're incredible maintenance headaches. So we've got 4 kids, and all of them don't aspire to that. 2 of them don't aspire to owning a car. And one of them doesn't aspire to working. But yeah. Stop cooking with cheese. So I think the next generation is, in fact, adapting the perspective, just as I'm sure my parents had to when the lots were bigger and you lived closer to town. Well, you could always move out, and unfortunately we still do that in Houston, we still do that in Calgary, we still take the urban containment boundary. I know communities where the planner says, oh no, we're good at drawing urban containment boundaries, we draw a new one every year. And so those ones will continue to sprawl, and we can't. So luckily we can't. We had one of our councillors actually advocate that, well, let's get rid of the ALR and let's sprawl for another couple of years until we run out of that. And then, we could keep sprawling at quarter acre gross density until we run out. And then, all we've done is forestall the inevitable, where the rest of the world has come here and said, really, we have to have a lawn? We don't have to have a lawn. We got one of our last story, one of our Syrian refugee widows, she wanted a little garden, and she lived her whole life in an apartment building in Aleppo, but we got her a townhouse, and so we gave her a little 4x8 plot of land. She planted it and did videos and tried to contemplate how this works, and it grew, and so she sent pictures back home because she's now a farmer. I don't think she has ever aspired to owning dirt, and there's so many of our new residents that don't, and so many of our existing residents don't either.
Great. Well, we touch in Mayor Stewart, you said, don't ask politicians to be courageous. Then who should we ask? what's the role of government, and Mayor Stewart, you were an MLA before, is the sort of decision-making authority, should it be shifted to senior levels of government? There has been some movement recently in the US, California, for example. In 2017, state law was passed to prevent cities from enacting bylaws that restricted accessory dwelling units. So those are basement suites, garage apartments, backyard cottages. In Oregon, the House Bill of 2001 proposed legislation mandating cities to allow up to 4plexes on single-family lots. So does that help if it's then the province that sort of blanket mandates these things?
I don't think you'll ever get it. I don't know that anyone's going to spend their political capital trying to solve my problem. It doesn't, regardless of political stripe. And I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a system that doesn't require the courage, rather than take away the hard decisions. Don't set it up so that we know, for example, that we get two complaints about paving. One, the road that I want to use needs to be repaved. And the other complaint is the road that I want to use is being repaved. And so we at public hearings, we only attract those that are going to be opposed to the project, and we design it so it's not going to attract anyone that supports the project unless they own a share in it. So yes, the YIMBY, I love New Westminster's approach. We want the YIMBY to come out. We try to stir that pot, but it's only because the system is stacked against it.
Go ahead, Jake.
And so to that end, I wanted to share, because I had good fortune of meeting a woman by the name of Denise Pinkerton, and she's the person who actually almost single-handedly did the California work. And what Denise did, she was an ex-planner at Marin County, and she went into private practice, hired by a company, and they're like, do an affordable housing thing right now, would you? And anyway, so I'm being a bit cheeky, but really what happened was she realized there were so many illegal garage suites. And so she said, you know what, we're going to legalize them. And so what she did is she took the risk out for the politicians, and she put together quite a fulsome coalition. So trade unions, pension groups, teachers union, nurses, like all the end users, she got those people on board. She got manufactured home people on board. She got builders associations on board. She was able to create a diverse enough group that it really spoke to how this went to the core of what the needs of the communities were. And I think what that does, when you start to take that voice to the regulators, and yes, I don't think the province is ever going to come down and go, oh no, you can do all this, is what you're going to do. But if you start to take the risk out, we start working at the coalition of municipalities, we start putting those type of connections through, which is, to be candid, is our aspiration at Small Housing BC, to be able to get those. We're going to make a road that is less filled with potholes, it's going to be a lot less risky, and it starts going to illustrate really what the population wants and what this population and communities need to move ahead.
Great. Go ahead.
I think that I felt lucky in my role in trying to move this forward by having other municipalities really pave the way in a lot of cases. So the work that Vancouver did in allowing laneway housing, being able to take people out, we did, bus tours and walking, we had walking tour maps and would send people out, and it took so much fear out of the conversation to go and walk around these units, send people out, or even just to take them out and say, what do you like and not like, and tell us that we can learn from this and do a better program for New Westminster. And so I've appreciated all the work that other people have done, that I can just build that momentum, and even if it's incremental, just to do one step at a time, but follow in the footsteps of others, and hopefully we can take turns throughout the region paving the ways that we can all benefit.
Michael?
Yeah, and I really advocate pilot projects where people can go and see as-built examples of proposed change. So Vancouver has a lot of great examples of more intense types of infill. And I think we should be, it's a housing crisis in the region. We really need to be, I think, more open, more creative, make it easier for developers and nonprofits and co-ops to do the right thing, to create more compact forms of housing that are inherently more affordable, but then do them design well. So, I mean, there was a co-op that founded the newest one in Vancouver at 9th and 33rd, and, at the time the city said, oh, well, it's nice that you guys are self-organizing to create 28 co-op housing units, co-housing units. We'd like you to build two rental units as well, too. So these 28 people, families that got together to build a co-housing project had to dig into their pockets to fund 2 extra rental units as part of their development. Thanks a lot. That's 100% mortgage financing. So those units aren't inherently more affordable to rent. There's just an extra requirement put on them by the city that says, well, we'd also like you to do two rental units. We need to have more open thinking and be more permissive and experiment more. I think we really need to do that to illustrate that you can do higher densities that are really livable and quite in character with the neighborhoods that you're doing this change in.
Great.
There's
time
one-
we're gonna, sorry, go ahead.
There's one other fix. We have to get the federal government to stop thinking single-family home is the form, because there is only one kind of housing that you can build in this country without paying income tax on the profitability, the profit that you earn, and that is a single-family home. You buy, and it happens every day, they'll buy a knockdown, tear it down, apply for a building permit, dig a hole, construct the thing. It takes about 18 months from purchase all the way through. Move into it for a year or be perceived as living in it for a year, and then they sell it. They've made $800,000 tax-free. And then they do it again, and they do it again. And we asked some of the builders, why don't you take the fourplex thing? Why don't you, we'll rezone it. It'll take a little bit longer, but you can make more money. And he says, yes, but I'd have to pay income tax. I don't have to pay income tax if I just build another single-family home to replace the one that's there. And I can put 3 suites in it to make it more affordable and all that stuff. We know that CRA has to get their head out of the sand on that too.
That's great points. We're gonna open it up to questions. There'll be 2 mics floating around, so if you raise your hand, a mic will come to you. Rebecca and Gordon. Oh, Rebecca, go ahead. First question.
Thank you. Bartholomew was doing something I haven't heard addressed. He was protecting status. And I think we're still protecting status by protecting single-family dwellings. It's greater status than multifamily living. I'd like your comments on that. The other one is what Michael addressed about the cost of financing. We still don't do, except for Van City, I believe, we still don't take the cost of the second largest expense in a family's household, which is transportation. So we still encourage people to drive until they can afford a mortgage. Why aren't we doing location-efficient mortgages?
Who wants to take that one? So there are 2 questions. Oh, go ahead, Mayor Stewart. Oh, no? Okay.
That's a very good question. Are there any other questions? I mean, it's $10,000 a year to own a car. If you can buy, I'm bad at math. That's $1,000 a month. That's $800 a month that you could pay more for a housing next to near transit if you can get rid of one of your cars. And the banks, we have a system that doesn't take that into account.
And the reality is, the threshold for financing a mortgage is 32% of gross income, and total debt service less than, was it 40? But in reality, we know, you guys are all paying 40% or 50% of your income on housing, either in rental or in ownership. So I agree. I think they should be a location-efficient mortgage.
The only thing I'd maybe put into that is just one of the things that it's not exactly answering your question, but I think it's something I'd like to draw out, which is that One of the things at Small Housing BC and our approach has really been that development should happen at the single family lot, in part because it's an effort to take the land speculation out of a project. If you're working with a homeowner, if it's a nonprofit working with a homeowner or a builder, and they're developing their property, there's not the same expectation as if I have bought a property, I've financed it for a year and a half while a project's happening, and I expect to make profit on that in addition to the project itself. So I think that's one thing. And on the parking front, we should pay for parking. I mean, in Vancouver, I know it's heresy, but there should be paid for parking. You should have a car, it should cost you money in addition to, because it costs the community money.
Great. I saw raise hands. Where is the mic? Go to right there.
Hi. We've talked a lot about the form and typologies of the buildings and density and life and the quality of living within those spaces, but we haven't there hasn't been much talk about ownership models, because when people do invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into a property, they expect a return. They expect a nest egg. They expect to retire. They don't want to sell it for, they expect a profit in the end. And I think that's typical and reasonable when you're investing that much money into something, because otherwise you'd invest that money into stocks or other investment.
Bitcoin.
Or Bitcoin. But that's not, but expecting a return is not sustainable, because every generation is expecting to make more on their investment than the rate of interest or of what do you call it? Inflation, thank you. So what other ownership models do you see as being potentially advantageous for developing alongside with increased density? Jake, you had mentioned incentivizing density with required affordable housing units within the developments. Do you think conditional zoning is something that could be used as a leverage for that?
Well, I mean, what we've been proposing with this one project is the idea that you would create and it's not anything new, but the fact that it's on a single lot, that you would create a density bonus based on an assurity that some of this will stay as affordable housing. You know, the expectation of profit is different, and I think anybody who owns a home in this environment or in the last 15 years in this part of the country has a very false sense of what it is to own a home. When you own a home and there's security, it's because there is an asset there, and it may fluctuate, but the idea that, and many of us have been benefactors of that someone's put in $10 and walked away with 100, that's atypical and that's unsupported. We've come to the end of that potentially, right? And so yes, what we talked about with the idea of having this perpetually affordable unit is that people would buy it, people would live in it for a term of time, they would sell it, it might meet inflation, but they're going to walk away ostensibly with rent money so they can go back into the housing at market world. And it's a stepping stone, right? And the idea is to create better stepping stones. It's not to create wealth generation beyond that, right?
I think their model is emerging, shared equity models. So BC Housing, through the Housing Hub, is promoting a shared equity program where the government will essentially invest part of your down payment alongside you, and in return will get paid out at the end whenever you either rent it or sell it. In Toronto, my friend Heather Tremaine is running Housing Options in Toronto, where they're doing a shared equity program as well. But in that case, it's a private development company that contributes some of the shared equity. So there are models emerging. They're common in the UK. And
yet people jointly buying property together now.
Yeah.
3 people coming together and buying a single-family home, and they split it up they're very formalized. Richard Bell, I know, is here. He's done some of these, and in fact, he himself has done one with his family, and it's a very successful way to get into the market, and it's kind of an end run around the Strata Act, but it's a good end run, and it works.
But I think there's demand measures and there's supply measures, and certainly I think it's funny, the debate. Supply doesn't matter, right? Anyone look for a townhouse in Vancouver lately? 3-bedroom townhouse? There's not enough of certain product, and I think we need to manage demand. We need to manage supply, but we've got to a point, as you can tell from our little income demographic T4 exercise, that housing prices have just detached from local incomes in a bad way.
Great, thank you. Any
your right.
other hands?
Over here.
All right, go ahead, Rebecca.
Thank you very much all for your comments. They're super insightful and thoughtful. And one of the things that all of your comments kind of brought up for me was, you know, we talk about NIMBYs, we talk about YIMBYs, we talk about these different agencies and different levels of government. What role do we have as voters or as informed citizens trying to make an impact on some of those different levels? Because it feels as if sometimes cities on their own are trying to figure all these things out, and they can learn from other cities and they can use pilot projects, but they're kind of beholden to the loudest, angriest, most negative voices each and every time. But then we kind of look to the more powerful people in the room, whether that's the province or the government at a federal level, and they have different incentives because they're not dealing with the individual conversations on the ground. So, like, broadly, how do we sort of voice our opinions about some of these issues when it comes to these different stakeholders and the people really making the decisions about zoning or about financing or about giving grants or about helping people actually live where they want to?
So from a city perspective, I want your time. I want you to come and give me thoughtful advice about what to implement. We've started, I can't say this word, but we've started to do representativeness analysis. I don't know why I can't make that come out of my mouth ever. But what we're trying to do is understand who's in the room and who's not in the room. So we have a lot of trouble getting renters into the room. We have a lot of trouble getting young people into the room. So we're trying to do a better job of understanding who's missing so that when council's making a decision, they know who's not there and who's not having a voice. But what that means is we're guessing of what that voice is wanting to say and what that voice needs. And so it's us trying to find ways to bring those voices actually into the conversation and bring their story so that we're not trying to make assumptions. So, one thing that I hadn't thought about not having kids was, a bunch of families came out to one of our events and talked about yes, I'm ready to live in this smaller form and I really want to be able to afford something, but I'm worried about how much noise my kids are going to make if they have a dance party in the living room. And, that's just not something that would occur to me. And so the more that we can have those conversations and bring different voices into the room, the more that I can help develop policy that better reflects what people need.
What she said. Because ultimately, I'm a believer in supply. We have to do both, and we can't just contemplate the demand side of it. It has to be included. And if we supply enough density, for example, developers will not be willing to pay more than $140 a buildable foot, but they are willing to pay it because there's not enough of it. And so obviously, if you throw more density into a community and everybody does it, then we're good. If half of the communities are doing it, Coquitlam is actually meeting its growth targets at Metro, but we're one of 4 communities that are meeting our growth targets, and others aren't. And so now what do we do? Because we know that we're not going to be able to produce as a region enough housing to meet the demand in the region, even if the demand doesn't grow, but we know it will likely continue to grow. So we have to supply as communities, and all of us do. There are 22 of us, and so I'd love to see the region also play a role in establishing best practice and advancing best practice so that we're not having the Port Moody's and Port Coquitlam's and Langley's and Township of Langley, City of North Van, Township of North Van, all of us trying to recreate the wheel in our communities, but take some best practices and put them, kind of adopt them right across the region so that the region can advance enough supply to meet the crisis that we're in.
I think you need to act. I think citizens have agency, right, mayor and council. You need to do this. But I think wouldn't it be really interesting if every year the city had a little check-in with all of its citizens and said, how are we doing on housing? Because I think when you do it issue by issue, application by application, you get the NIMBYs come out, and you get the YIMBYs out, but you forgot the nopes and the bananas. The bananas build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And a nope is not on planet Earth. So I do think we need to have these wider conversations and say, what are the and to your issue on representation and equity and on people who aren't in the room, people who aren't in the neighborhood. Like some people are advocating politically that we should devolve decision making to the block, hyper-localism. I mean, really? Is that going to get us any kind of positive change? I think we need to have a broader conversation across the city. How are we doing on housing? And citizens need to speak in large numbers about how we're doing on housing. So all of you have a role. All of you have agency. And I think, you know, we should do that. I think this is a great opportunity. I think every city should do a check-in once a year, not on a specific application, but how are we doing on housing? What should we be considering? New forms of housing? Do you support this? You know, I think that's a broad, that gives their politicians some broad direction.
And just to add on to it, I would say that it's really important too to listen to what the other people in the room are saying, because again, going back to my challenges with online world, it's so easy for you to send stuff to the city, but not to know what the other conversations are happening, what other people need. So it's not necessarily just about people like me hearing it, but other people understanding the messages and why that's important and why maybe they should be embracing change in their neighborhood.
Yeah, if you consider this a country club, and you're gonna set the price of admission, who are we gonna ask? We're gonna ask the members of the club who are already there what the price of admission should be, or should we ask those that want to be a member? Because right now, that's our reality, is that I have to listen to the people that live in Coquitlam already by the structure. And so I want those that don't live in Coquitlam and those that live in Coquitlam but are underhoused to be screaming at us. Because we don't hear their voices at the public hearing. And you forgot one, NIM2, not in my term of office.
All right.
There's one here.
Let's go in the back. Is that? I can't quite see. Great.
So bear with me, it might be a bit of a long question. So you guys have spoken a lot about equity tonight. And we know that several Commonwealth and some non-Commonwealth nations with very similar colonial settler nation patterns and discriminatory land use practices have or are considering building equity into legislations and land use bylaws that directly and specifically focus on redressing the imbalance and land use inequities of the past and present. For example, in South Africa's National Spluma Framework for Spatial Planning and Land Use Management, they've chosen to redress the imbalance of the past and to ensure that there's equity in the application of spatial development, planning and land use management systems, including empowering planners. The City of Portland has also moved forward with building and focusing on equity as their first guiding principle in their residential infill project. Historically in Canada, the federal government intervened during the housing crisis that presented itself at the time in the 1930s with the Dominion Housing Act and the National Housing Act to deal with housing affordability concerns for some, but not for all. Finally, in the 1930s, we know that there was the suspension of municipal zoning bylaws to assist single-family homeowners who were suffering from the high cost of maintaining a single-family home. This resulted in an increase in the number of homes being converted into rooming houses. Understanding that federal and provincial government intervention has occurred in the past and contributed to our current housing crisis, and that several other cities across North America have built social equity mainstreaming in land use bylaws, why are we still not pursuing these models?
Go for it.
I don't even know where to start. I think that we're trying to one piece at a time, and so it's tackling different elements as they arise, mostly based on where the need sort of seems the loudest. But you know, one of the problems that we're facing is the issue of amount of rental housing and the challenge with rent evictions. And so trying to respond to the lack of rental housing and really think about what incentives that we can put in place and how that we can start to shift that market. And I think that municipalities have a strong role in trying to advocate to the provincial and federal governments about ways that legislation can change to make our jobs easier, to better meet the needs of communities, and sort of pass on those messages that we might hear better at the local level. So I think that we're trying to tackle it in small ways from a municipal perspective.
I think we're in an interesting time. I think things are fairly wobbly in the development industry. You've got 4 levels of government all intervening with policy tools to slightly different ends. You saw the example of the stress test on the mortgage and the powerful impact that has on your ability to purchase a home. You've seen taxation policies with rental. You know, the fact that, you know, are you aware that a developer building a rental building has to self-assess and pay GST on that building before when the first unit gets rented out? I mean, there's just tax policy. Provincial property transfer tax. That wasn't such a big part of our economy, but now developers, through the property purchasers, through the property transfer tax, pay more to the BC government than mining and wood royalties. Like it's a huge income source for the province. So we have tax policies and government policies and mortgage lending policies that are operating at federal, provincial, regional, and city levels that all impact the availability, supply, and cost of housing. They're not all in harmony. And at the end of the day, developers have to balance all of that and make it viable. So I think we do need the four levels of government to sort of come together and figure out policy on housing.
That's ridiculous. Because I absolutely agree. It would be great, because ultimately there's two of those. I know the fourth one he's talking about, but the three traditional ones, two of them have access to income tax, which is the only tax that will actually help you redistribute income. You can't do it with property tax. You can do it with income tax. And yet we all look to the local government as saying, okay, you guys redistribute income on the housing side when you don't have access to the main tool that will help you do it. So we need federal. I'm glad the federal government's back in housing, glad the province is back in housing, and now let's everybody sit at the same table and not. It isn't helpful when we have a mayor out in I'm going to do that. Maple Ridge is an example of local community making a decision because they're allowed to. Their local communities are told, have a public hearing, make a decision based on what the public tells you. And then when you make the decision based on what the public tells you, the province will override you and that's an unusual circumstance. I spoke to the minister, and I actually agree with her that in that circumstance you needed to, but you needed to because the system is set up completely wrong to allow for the kind of housing response from local government that we need to see.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
Okay.
Did you have your hand up? Okay.
Thank you. So a two-part question. I wanted to take up Mayor Stewart's idea of best practices at the region. So I was wondering what you think would happen at the Planning Committee if you introduced a motion to have duplex zoning right through the whole region, that these RS1 zones become duplex zones. That's my first question. Second question is, I think it was a very courageous and progressive policy for the city, the last council, to introduce duplex zoning right through the city. I wanted to know what Jake and Michael thought about what they think the market take-up will be. Will there be a lot of single-family homes demolished and people taking up the opportunity to build duplexes right through the city?
Okay, on your first question, Metro Vancouver doesn't have a housing function. It doesn't have it doesn't have the mandate. It doesn't have the legislative authority. So we considered ultra vires for it to try to impose some kind of a thing like that. So what I was contemplating, I was chair of the Metro Vancouver Housing at the time, and housing is primarily deals with 3,300 units of housing that Metro Vancouver owns, and a little bit of housing policy. And I want the housing policy to expand a little bit so that we could see Metro Vancouver advance positions that local governments could, so why are we all trying to redesign the basement suite or the duplex or the triplex and come up with some model bylaw sorts of approaches, whatever. But I don't think we could ever take a vote that simply mandates or changes the rules for all of the communities in Metro Vancouver. Although there are some issues where I would love to have a senior level of government come in and impose it on me. I would scream because I have to, and then I would secretly thank them.
The duplex is a very interesting critter. If we took a property and we duplexed it, and then we said, open it up to our T4 cohort, we wouldn't have any more buyers than we did at the end of Michael's session. There does not create an affordability that's attainable. One of my big concerns too on that is that you know, one thing that's, and I think it was important to cool down the real estate market, but, you know, one unintended consequence is we probably sitting with something well over 10%. I mean, I'm somewhat guessing, but we're sitting with a lot of single-family lots that were bought under a premise of speculation that will sit fallow. In some cases, I've seen lovely homes ruined as they sit fallow, and they're going to sit there until the property creeps up again. And I think we lost land or lost potential housing in that. I think it was important to cool down the market, but now we need this other tool. We need to kind of reinvigorate the neighborhoods, and I think duplex doesn't go enough. We need to go much further. But again, if we do these things citywide and we do them in a diverse enough manner, then we'll start to get, you know, whether directly or indirectly, starting to get these pilot projects going in. And it's out of that process we'll see a route forward, how we can build the communities effectively, get more people in the street, get more kids in the school, get some kids having to move hockey nets in the laneways, and that's going to reinvigorate the community in a really significant way. And I think we have that problem across the province.
Yeah, I agree with Jake. It's not, they didn't go far enough. It's just a modest change. It's not really going to affect the economics or the supply of housing. I think it needs to be a quad or higher. It's like figure skating. You know, a triple's nothing. You need to show me a quintuple? A quintuple spin. It's got to be, it has to be much, and I think actually we can't just talk about the same density. I think we need more density on those properties. It can't be 0.7 FSR. I mean, Jake and I have been working on this permanently affordable housing model where you bonus up some density and go to 0.9 or maybe even 1 FSR. And you get one unit that spins out as an affordable unit in perpetuity, affordable to a family making $80,000 a year. That's going to create some opportunities. We know how to do it. Like all of these beautiful laneway homes, and they're strata titled in Kitts and Mount Pleasant. They're good examples of how you can do density well. At 1.2 FSR, you're into sort of townhomes. And I think at that scale, you just let it go to townhomes. But I don't think it duplexes. I mean, look, I showed you a picture of a duplex in 1927 for $2,650. I mean, that's old hat.
Great. Any final thoughts? That was our last question, but any final thoughts, plugs, anything you didn't get to get off your chest on this topic? Are we good? Okay. Oh, okay.
I started with the premise that don't ask local governments to be courageous because we don't set it up that way. I will finish with the thought that when they are courageous, we should thank them. And when they're courageous to the point where they lose the election, we should thank her. Thank you, Heather. Heather is actually one of those that I truly, truly miss. We're politically opposite ends of everything, I think, to some degree, but I truly miss her and her involvement, and there were so many that every election we will lose people because we've set up a system to not reward the best decisions, but rather to reward the decisions that the protectionists, quite often, the safe decisions, the ones that protectionists ask us to make, because the people that desperately need the housing aren't there yet.